It happened in the early hours of a Roman morning, while most of the world was still asleep. A statement moved through Vatican corridors, passed from desk to desk, carrying the weight of nearly 4 decades of unfinished business. And for the first time since a summer day in Switzerland in 1988, the office of the Roman Pontiff had placed on record something that the faithful of the traditional movement had waited a generation to hear from this papacy. Pope Leo XIV had spoken about Écône, and no one, not the cardinals who thought they knew him, not the theologians who had mapped his every public word, not the journalists who covered the Vatican beat, had seen it coming. Take a moment, if you will, to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. You are not alone in asking these questions. Thousands of Catholics around the globe are watching this story unfold, searching for clarity, searching for the church they were raised to love. To understand why this moment carries such weight, you have to go back. Not to last year, not to the pontificate of Francis, not even to the cautious overtures of Benedict XVI. You have to go back to a hillside in the Swiss canton of Valais, to a place called Écône. The seminary of St. Pius X at Écône was founded in 1971 by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a French prelate who had served as a papal representative in Africa, who had governed dioceses, who had sat as a father of the Second Vatican Council itself. He was not a radical by formation. He was not a man who came from the margins. He was formed entirely within the structures of the Church, had given his life to her, and had watched with growing anguish what he believed was a dismantling of everything he had served. When the reforms of the Council swept through the liturgical life of Catholicism in the years after 1965, Lefebvre drew a line. He would not follow the new rite. He would not abandon what he called the Mass of all time, and he would train priests to say it. Lefebvre believed the ancient rite carried within it a theology of sacrifice and priesthood that the new form had obscured. He had watched congregations drift. He had seen young men leave seminaries uncertain about what the priesthood even was. He believed the Church was bleeding from a wound it had inflicted on itself, and he was going to build an ark. That ark was Écône. Rome watched him with growing unease through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Warnings were issued. Talks broke down. The Vatican suspended the Society's canonical standing in 1975, declaring it suppressed, though Lefebvre refused to recognize the validity of that act and continued his work regardless. In 1976, he celebrated a public mass in Lille for 10,000 faithful, defying an explicit request from Pope Paul VI not to do so. It was one of the great public acts of ecclesiastical defiance of the 20th century, carried out not in anger, but in what Lefebvre described as sorrow and duty. The relationship between the Archbishop and Rome became one of the defining tensions of that decade. Then came the summer of 1988. Lefebvre was 82 years old. He believed he was dying, and he believed that if he did not act, the traditional priesthood would die with him. He had been negotiating with Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, over a potential agreement that would have regularized the society within the Church. A protocol was signed in May of 1988. Both men placed their names on it. There was a real possibility in those weeks that something historic could be accomplished, but Lefebvre backed away. He had requested the right to consecrate a bishop without papal permission, and he had been told no. He did not believe Rome would honor its commitments. He did not believe the reforms would be reversed. He had made his decision. On the 30th of June 1988, under the open sky at Écône, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre consecrated 4 priests of the Society as bishops: Bernard Fellet, Bernard Tissier de Mallarès, Richard Williamson, and Alfonso de Galarreta. Consecrating alongside him was Bishop Antonio de Castro Maia of Brazil. The evening before, Cardinal Ratzinger had sent a telegram in the name of the Holy Father, asking Lefebvre, paternally and firmly, to come to Rome rather than proceed. Lefebvre did not come. He celebrated the consecrations. He preached a sermon those present would never forget. He called it an operation of survival. He said he was preserving a priesthood for the time when Rome would return to its senses. He was not angry. He was sorrowful. He was certain. He was 82 years old, standing in the alpine air, doing what he believed God required of him. The response from Rome came 2 days later. Pope John Paul II issued Ecclesia Dei Afflicta, a document whose title means the afflicted Church of God. In it, the Pope described the consecrations as a schismatic act, one that, in his words, implied in practice the rejection of the Roman primacy. The penalty of excommunication fell immediately and automatically on Lefebvre, on de Castromaya, and on the 4 newly consecrated bishops. The Society of St. Pius X continued to function, to train priests, to celebrate the traditional Mass across dozens of countries, but it did so in a state of canonical irregularity, cut off from full communion with Rome. John Paul II, in the same document, established the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, an institution charged with reaching out to Catholics attached to traditional liturgy who wished to remain in communion with Rome. He was acknowledging that Lefebvre had not acted in a vacuum, that hundreds of thousands of faithful Catholics shared the Archbishop's love for the ancient rite, and that the Church had to find a way to hold them. Lefebvre died in 1991, still excommunicated. He was buried at Écône, surrounded by the tradition he had refused to surrender. The wound was open, and Rome for many years left it largely unaddressed. In the years that followed his death, the society he built continued to grow. Priories opened in new countries. New seminaries were established in the United States and in Argentina. The priests trained at Écône fanned out across the world, and in their wake came communities of faithful who felt they had found something the ordinary parish no longer offered: reverence, doctrinal clarity, the sense of standing in an unbroken line reaching back through centuries of prayer. These were not fringe figures. They were doctors and farmers, engineers and teachers, grandmothers and young fathers with children in hand. People who prayed the rosary and fasted on Fridays and worried about the faith their children would inherit. By the early years of this century, the society was serving hundreds of thousands of Catholics globally. It had become, in a strange way, one of the most visible signs that the wounds of the post-conciliar Church had not healed. Then came Benedict XVI. Joseph Ratzinger had spent 17 years as John Paul II's doctrinal prefect, and the SPX question never left his mind. He understood the wound from the inside, had watched it form in real time, and carried a sense of personal responsibility for what had happened at Écône. As Pope, he moved on 2 fronts. In 2007, he issued Summorum Pontificum, declaring that the traditional Mass of 1962 had never been formally abrogated and could be celebrated freely by any priest. It was, in effect, a vindication of Lefebvre's central claim. The old rite had never been legitimately suppressed. Then, on the 21st of January 2009, the Congregation of Bishops issued a decree signed by its prefect, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re. The excommunications of the 4 bishops consecrated at Écône were lifted. Benedict accompanied the decree with a personal letter to the bishops of the world. He wrote of mercy. He wrote of unity. He made clear that lifting the excommunication did not resolve the canonical situation of the society, did not grant faculties to their priests, did not constitute full regularization. The wound was cleaned, but not yet closed. The society was still canonically irregular. Its priests still lacked the ordinary faculties to hear confessions or assist at marriages in the juridically unambiguous way. Rome had removed the penalties from the bishops, but the structure between the society and the Church remained unresolved. And then came Francis. Pope Francis, by temperament and theological instinct, was everything the SSPX leadership feared most. He was pastoral where they wanted doctrine. He was flexible where they wanted clarity. And yet he surprised people. In 2015, during the extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy, he announced that the faithful who approached SPX priests for confession would receive valid and licit absolution. He extended that faculty indefinitely in November of 2016. Then, in April of 2017, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith published a document allowing local bishops to grant SSPX priest faculties to assist validly at marriages. The canonical irregularity persisted. The society was not formally schismatic, a point the Vatican had been careful to maintain, but it remained outside, tolerated but unresolved, present but not whole. In 2021, Francis issued Traditionis Custodes, which walked back Summorum Pontificum and placed the traditional Mass once again under the control of local bishops. For the traditional movement, it felt like a second betrayal. The wound cracked open again. Francis died on the 21st of April, 2025. He was buried, as he had requested, in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, not in the Vatican grottos alongside his predecessors. The conclave that followed was watched by the entire Catholic world with unusual intensity, and by no community more intently than the faithful of the traditional movement. They had endured 4 years of tightening restriction. They had watched Summorum Pontificum reversed. They wanted to know what kind of man would Rome choose now. What would happen to the ancient Mass? What would happen to Écône? Pope Leo XIV was elected on the 8th of May, 2025. His background, his formation, his past statements about the liturgy were analyzed immediately and exhaustively by every faction within the Church. What did he believe about the Old Mass? What did he think of the SPX? Would he find a way to bring the society home? The answers came slowly, in pieces, often through secondary voices rather than his own. In February of 2026, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, who led the Vatican's doctrinal office, made a public proposal to the society, a specifically theological dialogue, a formal path of discussion, on the condition that the society suspend its announced plan to consecrate 4 new bishops at Écône on the 1st of July 2026. The society had announced this after the death of Bishop Tissier de Mallarès, one of the original 4 consecrated by Lefebvre, who had died in 2024. They needed new bishops. Rome had not given permission. The society declined to suspend. Its leadership argued that they had been waiting for regularization for nearly 4 decades, that Rome had offered dialogue before, and nothing had come of it. The preparations at Écône continued. By May of 2026, the Vatican issued what the press described as a final warning. The planned consecrations would constitute a schismatic act, using the same language John Paul II had used in 1988, and would incur automatic excommunication. Pope Leo XIV himself, through the statement of Cardinal Fernandez, was described as praying that the leaders of the society would reconsider what Rome called an extremely grave decision. This is the world in which something unexpected happened. This is the context into which Pope Leo XIV's direct address on Écône arrived. What makes the moment so striking is not simply what was said, but that it was said at all, in this form, at this register. For the first 18 months of his pontificate, Leo XIV had communicated on the SSPX question largely through intermediaries, through carefully worded Vatican statements that maintained the official line without the personal register of a man speaking from his own heart. The July 1 crisis was pressing. The question of whether history would repeat itself, whether Écône would again become the site of a rupture that fractured the Church for another generation, was not hypothetical. It had a date on the calendar, and then the Pope addressed it directly. He acknowledged the seminary by name. He acknowledged the 38 years. He acknowledged, in language the Vatican had not used since Benedict's explanatory letter in 2009. The genuine love of tradition that lives within the society and within the faithful who follow it. He did not retreat from the canonical position. He did not grant permission for the consecrations. He did not offer regularization without conditions. But he spoke to Écône not as an institution to be warned, but as a wound that needed tending. He named Lefebvre not as a schismatic, but as a pastor whose pain the Church had not always heard with patience. He acknowledged that Rome owed the faithful of the traditional movement more than warnings and restrictions, that the love they bore for the ancient rite was not disobedience in its origin, but devotion. In a pontificate that had given the SPX few moments of warmth, it was a shift that no analyst had predicted. The statement circulated through the Catholic press within hours. At SPX chapels in France, in the United States, in Argentina, in Poland, the faithful read it on their phones before Mass. Some wept. Some were skeptical, having heard hopeful words from Rome before. Many simply sat with it, trying to understand what it meant for the July 1 date that was now only weeks away. The Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, established in 1988 as the institutional bridge between Rome and the traditional movement, had been folded into the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under Francis. The institutional mechanism for dialogue had been reduced. What Leo XIV seemed to be doing was not rebuilding that mechanism formally, but performing the gesture that any mechanism would require to function. The acknowledgement that the other party had a reason for being where they were, a legitimate grief wrapped around a genuine love, and that Rome had not always responded to that love with the patience it deserved. The division at Écône was never simply a canonical dispute. It went to the deepest questions of what the Church is, what the Mass is, what it means to transmit faith across generations. The SPX was never motivated by hatred of the Church. Lefebvre's sermon at Écône on that June day in 1988 was not a declaration of war. It was a lament. He spoke of keeping something alive until Rome recovered what he believed it had lost. Whether one agrees with his conclusion or not, the emotional register was not rebellion but grief. There is a generation of Catholics now, in their 50s and 60s, who grew up within the society. They were baptized at Écône chapels. They were married there. They buried their parents there. They have lived their entire sacramental lives within an institution the Vatican called irregular, and they have done so not out of obstinacy, but out of love for something they believe is irreplaceable. For them, the question of Écône is not an abstract canonical debate. It is their whole life. And when a pope finally spoke to that life, with pastoral tenderness rather than disciplinary warning, the response was not merely political. It was personal. It was the feeling, after 38 years, of being seen. Pope Leo XIV's words touched that register. They did not endorse it. They did not validate the conclusion Lefebvre reached. But they acknowledged the grief as real, as Catholic in its origin, as worthy of a pastoral response rather than only a canonical one. For the faithful watching from a distance, the meaning of this moment is not yet fully legible. History does not offer its meaning at once. The consecrations of 1988 were not understood in their full significance on July 1 of that year. They unfolded over decades. What Benedict did in 2009 could not have been predicted in 1989. What Francis restricted in 2021 would have seemed impossible in 2010. The Church moves on its own time. What is also true is that the July 1 date remains on the calendar. Whether Leo XIV's words change the society's course, whether they open a path of genuine dialogue, whether the consecrations go forward and history repeats itself in that Alpine valley, no one yet knows. The situation is still live. The canonical crisis is still unresolved. And in that uncertainty, what Leo XIV did by speaking directly was not to solve the problem, but to change. the register in which it is being held. He moved the conversation from the language of discipline to the language of pastoral care. That shift matters. It does not guarantee an outcome, but it creates a different kind of space. And in that space, things that could not have been said in the language of warnings and decrees might now be said. But this much is clear. For 38 years, the name Écône carried a particular weight in Vatican conversations. It was the name of a place where a line had been crossed, where the Church had fractured visibly and painfully, and where the consequences were still being lived by hundreds of thousands of Catholics who attended Mass in a building the Vatican called irregular. The popes who came after 1988 circled that name carefully. They addressed the crisis in degrees. They removed penalties, granted faculties, opened dialogues, but none of them, in the official register of a direct papal address, had turned to face Écône and spoken to it as a wound, as a grief, as a place where something of the Church's own heart had been held in trust for a generation that did not know whether it would be welcomed back. That is what happened. That is why the faithful who heard it stopped where they were. That is why, in chapels and living rooms, and before early morning masses in cities across the Catholic world, people who have carried this wound for their entire adult lives found themselves unexpectedly still, listening to a pope who had decided, finally, to speak. Whether it is enough, whether it changes the July 1 decision, whether the Society and Rome find a way through what is still an open, canonical crisis is not yet known. The Church lives in hope, not in certainty. But the silence of 38 years, the careful official silence around the name of that Swiss hillside and the meaning of what happened there has been broken. A pope has spoken, and what happens next belongs to the unfolding mercy of God, and no one saw it coming.